In the summer of 2023, a group of kayakers exploring the waterways of North Stradbroke Island, 30 kilometers southeast of Brisbane, saw something that had no business being there. Half submerged among the reeds along the bank, measuring close to 3 meters from snout to tail, was a saltwater crocodile. Not a large lizard misread in the glare, not a drifting log. Crocodilus porosus, the largest living reptile on Earth, in waters that every official map in Queensland declares free of that species. They called the authorities. Rangers arrived, drones, boats, specialists flown in from the far north. They searched for days. The animal was never found. But the report was logged, and it joined a file that has been getting longer every year, always pointing in the same direction. For that to mean anything, you need to understand where a saltwater crocodile is supposed to stop, and more importantly, why the people whose job is to enforce that boundary are no longer fully certain that it holds. The southern limit of the species is not vague or disputed. It is a monitored, surveyed, scientifically defended line. In eastern Australia, saltwater crocodiles are distributed all along the Queensland coast and the Northern Territory, thinning out as you move south until they effectively disappear around Gladstone, roughly 600 kilometers north of Brisbane. Below that line, the species does not exist in the wild. That is the rule. That is what the wildlife management plans, the university studies, and the conservation agency documents have maintained for decades. The reason sounds airtight. The saltwater crocodile is an ectotherm. It cannot produce its own heat. It takes its temperature from the environment around it, and that dependency governs everything: its metabolism, its digestion, its ability to hunt, to breed, to survive. Above 30 degrees Celsius, the animal thrives. It is fast, efficient, and extraordinarily dangerous. Below 20, its metabolism starts to fall. Below 15, it stops feeding entirely. Cold is not merely uncomfortable for this animal. It is a physiological ceiling. Queensland's subtropical south means cool winters. The Tasman Sea, which washes the coast of New South Wales, drops to 13 or 14 degrees Celsius in midwinter. By the standard model, that temperature profile makes this coastline impossible territory for an adult saltwater crocodile. The cold is the wall. That argument has kept the map stable for generations, and the logic behind it has never been seriously challenged. Until the map started producing exceptions it had no category for. The North Stradbroke incident was not a single anomaly in an otherwise clean record. Pull up the documented sightings from the past several years, and a pattern emerges that is uncomfortable to explain away. In 2019, a crocodile, already dead, its skin removed, was found in the Murray River, more than 2,000 kilometers from any known population. Authorities concluded it had died far to the north and drifted, but it was there. In 2020, a freshwater crocodile, the saltwater's smaller cousin, was struck and killed by a car in northern New South Wales, more than 1,000 kilometers outside its documented range. A ranger from Queensland, who had spent 20 years working with the species, described the discovery as the kind of thing you spend your career not expecting to see. Unconfirmed sightings continued in the years that followed. And then North Stradbroke, a possible individual, seen clearly, reported by multiple witnesses, 600 kilometers south of the recognized boundary. Each case, examined in isolation, carries a convenient explanation. A carcass carried south by a current, an animal that escaped from a farm during a flood, a misidentified lace monitor. None of them individually forces anyone to reconsider the map, but taken together, accumulating year after year, clustering in the same types of habitat, always pointing south, they begin to look less like a catalogue of coincidences and more like a direction. Something is changing or being changed, or both at once. And the scientists trying to determine which cannot yet agree, because the evidence keeps fitting two entirely different stories. The first story starts somewhere most people would not look for it, which is in the data on what extreme heat is doing to crocodiles in the north. Between 2008 and 2023, researchers at the University of Queensland, working with Australia Zoo's field team, tracked more than 200 wild saltwater crocodiles at the Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve on Cape York Peninsula, the northernmost tip of Queensland, deep inside what everyone pictures as classic crocodile country. They implanted acoustic devices beneath the animal's skin to record body temperature in real time. then compared those readings against local air and water temperatures across 15 years. The results were published in early 2025, and they changed how researchers think about the threat this species actually faces. The animal's average body temperature rose steadily across the study period. The peaks aligned with El Niño events. During those heatwave periods, the researchers found that nearly every crocodile in the study shifted almost exclusively to cooling behaviors, diving deeper, seeking out shade, hauling onto the riverbank at night when the water was warmer than the air above it. Their swimming performance declined, their diving endurance dropped. At their upper thermal limit, somewhere around 32 or 33 degrees Celsius, their ability to hunt, flee from threats, and reproduce became significantly compromised. Caitlin Barham, one of the lead researchers on the project, put it plainly: when crocodiles spend their time and energy on staying cool, there is less of both available for everything else. They become less effective hunters. They become less competitive in territorial disputes, and in a species where individual fitness determines access to the best breeding sites, that matters enormously. Here is the turn that nobody sees coming. The saltwater crocodile does not only have a cold limit, it has a heat limit, and that heat limit is not theoretical or distant. The most intense El Niño year on record saw animals in Cape York operating within striking distance of it. The north, the place where this species is supposed to be at its most comfortable and dominant, is getting hot enough to become physiologically stressful. And the south, for the first time in any living researcher's career, is getting warm enough to become survivable. That is where El Niño enters the picture, from a completely different angle. El Niño is the periodic warming of the central and eastern Pacific Ocean that reorganizes the weather system across the southern hemisphere. In Australia, its effects are well documented. Drought across the east, delayed monsoon seasons, temperatures running significantly above the historical average. But there is something more specific that happens along the southeastern coast during a strong event, something that matters enormously for any large reptile trying to extend its range. The Tasman Sea warms, not by some dramatic amount, 1 degree above the seasonal average, sometimes 2, but for an animal operating at the margin of its cold tolerance, 1 degree is not background noise. It is the margin itself. The El Niño event that began developing in 2022 and peaked through 2023 and into 2024 was one of the most intense in recent decades. Sea surface temperatures along the northern New South Wales coast during the 2023 summer exceeded what would normally be recorded at the peak of a typical summer. The threshold water temperature below which a saltwater crocodile essentially shuts down was crossed later in the season than usual and recovered earlier in the spring. The window during which the coastal waters of New South Wales were physiologically navigable, not comfortable, not ideal, but navigable, was measurably wider than it would have been in a neutral or La Niña year. The clusters of southern sightings are not randomly distributed across the calendar. They concentrate around El Niño periods and their immediate aftermath, when the eastern seaboard has absorbed months of accumulated heat from a warmer than usual ocean to the east. That pattern on its own would be a reasonably compelling story. A warming climate opening a thermal window. A species beginning to fill it. A boundary that was drawn in a different era starting to slide. But the evidence refuses to close neatly around that explanation, because there is a second story that accounts for exactly the same sightings in exactly the same locations. And it has nothing to do with ocean temperatures. Australia has a crocodile farming industry. It was built in response to one of this country's most dramatic conservation recoveries. By the late 1960s, decades of uncontrolled hunting had reduced the wild saltwater crocodile to perhaps 2% of its pre-European numbers in the Northern Territory. The response in the early 1970s was to grant the species full federal protection, while simultaneously allowing licensed captive breeding to continue supplying the international leather market without touching wild populations. The recovery that followed exceeded almost every projection. The species now numbers over 100,000 individuals in the Northern Territory alone. That recovery also created a permanent supply chain of live crocodiles in private and commercial hands. Queensland has licensed crocodile farms that are open to visitors. The Northern Territory has active operations that breed animals at scale. And alongside the legitimate industry, an informal market persists. A juvenile saltwater crocodile is dramatic, exotic, and in the early months of its life small enough to keep. It is also an animal that grows steadily, continuously, and without slowing down, until the novelty of owning it collides with the reality of housing an apex predator in a suburban property. At that point, the predictable decision gets made. The records are full of the aftermath. Official wildlife files in New South Wales document captive origin juveniles found wandering backyards on the coast. There are cases attributed to circus animals that escaped decades ago, and whose descendants are theorized to still surface occasionally in certain rivers. The files also contain entries for tropical caimans, imported from South America, a different genus entirely, that were caught and recorded in the same databases as native crocodile sightings. The data is contaminated in ways that specialists acknowledge openly and that cannot be cleaned up retroactively. But the central problem is simpler and harder to solve than any database issue. A released captive animal and a genuine wild disperser are physically indistinguishable. They have the same body plan. They occupy the same kinds of habitat. They behave in ways that look identical from the bank of an estuary. When a wildlife officer encounters a saltwater crocodile in southeastern Queensland or northern New South Wales, the first question asked is whether the animal shows signs of captive origin. Unusually smooth scale patterns from a life without abrasion, behavior that is atypically unbothered by human proximity, body condition that does not match the nutritional profile of a long-distance wild forager. In the majority of confirmed cases south of Gladstone, the official finding is the same word: inconclusive. Not wild, not released, inconclusive. The dot on the map looks identical regardless of how the animal got there. And then there is a third layer that makes the whole picture stranger than either explanation handles on its own. Observe where these animals consistently appear. Not in pristine remote estuaries far from human infrastructure, not in wilderness areas with minimal human footprint. They surface in drainage channels cutting through coastal residential developments, in ornamental lakes on golf courses, in flood retention basins on the outskirts of towns, in the tidal sections of rivers running past aquaculture operations and boat harbors, in the same bodies of water that coastal communities have spent decades modifying, warming, and enriching, not with any intention of creating crocodile habitat, but effectively doing so anyway. Fish and prawn farms discharge water that runs warm relative to the surrounding estuary. Rivers draining agricultural land arrive at the coast, carrying elevated temperatures. Urban water bodies ringed by heat-absorbing concrete and asphalt stay warmer than nearby natural waterways. Rivers altered by weirs and flood control structures develop deep, still pools that remain thermally stable through the coolest months of a New South Wales winter, stable enough, potentially, to carry a large ectotherm through the season without the cold dropping past the threshold that kills. Whether a crocodile got there by navigating south along a warmer-than-usual coastline over the course of weeks or months, or arrived in the back of a vehicle and was released before dawn at the nearest boat ramp, it ends up in the same places. Because the human-modified water that would hide a released animal is also the human-modified water that offers a wild disperser its best prospect of surviving a winter. We did not intend to build a corridor. We may have built one anyway. One last thing makes this harder to dismiss. A crocodile that finds reliable food near human settlement, that gradually grows accustomed to the presence of people, loses the extreme wariness that keeps large crocodiles invisible in their natural habitats. And a crocodile that stops hiding is exactly the kind of animal that generates a report, becomes a data point and gets added to the file. Which means the animals appearing in the record are not necessarily the most numerous. They are the least cautious. And the least cautious, in every documented case, are the ones living in closest proximity to people. The researchers who study this cannot tell you with certainty how many of the southern sightings are natural dispersers and how many are released animals. This is not from lack of effort or care. The evidence genuinely does not allow a definitive answer. Queensland's wildlife authorities do not currently classify any sighting south of the recognized range boundary as evidence of a confirmed range shift. Not because they have ruled it out, because they cannot rule it in either. Not with the monitoring tools they have, not with the data they can collect. What they say when pushed sounds like hedging and is not. They say that some of these animals are almost certainly released captive animals. They say that some of them almost certainly are not. They say that the climate is shifting in the direction that would make southeastern Australia progressively more viable territory for a dispersing saltwater crocodile. And they say that distinguishing between those forces, animal by animal, estuary by estuary, is practically impossible with current capacity. That is not evasion. It is the only honest position available when the same evidence keeps fitting two different explanations with equal precision. So stand back from any individual animal and look at the whole file at once. A species that was nearly gone 50 years ago has recovered beyond all expectations and is now pressing against the thermal limits of the territory it dominates in the north. A coastline to the south that was physiologically impassable for most of recorded history is warming, not in a straight line, but in pulses. El Niño opens the window, La Niña closes it, and each cycle the baseline shifts a fraction further toward the warm, a pet trade that has placed animals in impossible locations for generations, and a chain of human-modified waterways running down the eastern seaboard, built for drainage and fish farming and flood control, that nobody designed as habitat for the world's largest reptile, and that may be functioning as a stepping stone corridor all the same. None of these forces alone explains the file. Together in proportions that nobody can yet measure, they may explain all of it. A warming climate, a careless pet trade, and an animal far more physiologically resilient than the range maps ever accounted for, all pushing south, all producing the same result when they arrive. The boundary line has not officially moved, but boundaries are not walls. They are the places where everything that was supposed to hold starts to be tested, and something is testing this one. Right now, in the warm discharge behind a fish farm somewhere along that coast, in the deep still pool at the back of a modified estuary, in the water that human settlement made just survivable enough without meaning to, an animal is waiting, not lost, not confused, not diminished by the distance from where it is supposed to be, just waiting for the water to stay warm long enough.